I'm a huge fan of Hobbits, and I've always wanted a good, solid Hobbity RPG. I know you have halflings in D&D, and of course you have halflings in every fantasy Heartbreaker RPG ever made, but those are off-brand Hobbits. A few years back, I published my own halfling one-shot for D&D and Index Card RPG, but really the closest I ever got to true Hobbity greatness was reading Underhill by Water by Josh McCrowell, published in 2020. This game's tagline is, "Adventures? No thank you." And the game explores all the agrarian, largely non-violent day-to-day doings of halflings, complete with feasts, home brewing, and gossip. But that's just all halflings. If you want name-brand Middle-earth hobbity hobbits of the Shire and the Bree, complete with the threat of the Dark Lord himself corrupting your soul and growing weary, miserable, and wounded from days of travel and the roller coaster of hope and despair that comes with the desperate journey, you need The One Ring. The One Ring 2nd edition was published by Free League in 2021 after a pretty wildly successful Kickstarter campaign. Its lead writer was Francesco Nepitello, author of the 1st edition of The One Ring, which was published in 2011. They also brought back the original designer Marco Maggi. The 1st edition was published by Cubicle 7 and was a huge hit at the time, winning 2 Ennies and an Origins Award and some others. This edition uses a tweaked rule set and brings with it the renewed vigor and momentum of Free League itself. Right out of the gate, that includes things like a boxed starter set, specialty dice, and cloth maps. It's important to note that this game is based on The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and none of the other books that Tolkien wrote, nor any of the expanded lore established by other authors or video games or anything like that. This is an important note because it limits the scope of this game's presentation of the setting down to one very specific moment in Middle-earth's history. The timeline presented is narrow too. It doesn't start you off at the beginning of the First Age and catch you up on the full breadth of Middle-earth's history. It doesn't even start you off at the beginning of the Third Age. It starts in 2941, the year that Bilbo Baggins sets off on his original quest. And it ends at 2965, about 50 years before the start of the events of The Lord of the Rings. That's actually a pretty important feature of the game. Sauron has not yet risen, Saruman has not even come close to his betrayal. Technically, Frodo Baggins himself isn't even born for another 3 years. A quick note about the artwork in this book. There are 2 styles going on. The main pages have this sort of rough draft penciled in style that gives a sort of journal feel. And then there are the chapter header spreads that display a style you're probably very familiar with if you've read Symbaroum and a number of other Free League games. I dig both styles myself. So as far as the mechanics go in this game, it's pretty interesting. You use a pool of d6s plus either 1 or 2 d12s on every throw. The d6s are called your success dice, and the d12s are your feat dice. There are some special symbols in place of some numbers on the dice. The 6 on the d6 is the elvish sort of T, which represents extra levels of success. The 11 on the d12 is the Eye of Sauron symbol, and the 12 on the d12 is the Gandalf rune, both of which have a few different meanings that I'll explain in a minute. But basically, you roll for 3 different situations. A skill roll, of which there are 18 skills, a combat roll, using your combat proficiency if attacking, or a protection roll if you're defending, and a shadow test, defending against sources such as dread, sorcery, or greed. When you want to make a roll, you add up your relevant stats, and then that tells you the number of d6s or success dice you get to roll. You also roll 1 d12 or a feat die. If the situation dictates that you are favored or ill-favored, then you roll 2d12 and take the better or worse of the two. The favor mechanic is pretty much identical to the advantage-disadvantage mechanic in D&D 5e. So once all of your dice are rolled, you actually add them up and compare the sum against your target number. You want to meet or beat that target number. The target for skill checks is determined by one of your 3 core stats. The Gandalf rune for 12 on the d12 means that you automatically succeed the roll no matter what the other dice say, which is pretty crazy. And the Eye of Sauron symbol for the 11 translates to a numerical value of 0, meaning the feat die will add nothing to your total sum. The special symbol for the number 6 on the d6 may trigger extra positive effects depending on what you're doing. You can spend these special successes, provided that your overall roll beat the target number, on one of 6 special perks listed here. These come up frequently enough that it would be nice to make sure that every player has a copy of this table right in front of them while playing, at least until they've memorized it. The game accounts for bonus dice and penalty dice that can add or take away from your d6 dice pool before throw. You can buy 1 bonus d6 with a precious hope point, and if your character is in a blessed state called inspired, that hope point actually buys 2 d6s for the roll. There are 3 conditions in the game that, if acquired, will affect your character in a hard mechanical way. Being miserable means that if you roll an Eye of Sauron, the roll is an automatic failure. Being weary means that any 1, 2, or 3 on a d6 equals 0. And being wounded slows down your endurance point recovery and increases your chance of getting knocked out of combat. And that's it for action resolution in the game, although to be honest, there are a lot more little mechanical bits and pieces going on. We'll get to them as they are presented in the book. So, this game has 4 playable races: humans, elves, dwarves, and hobbits. This right here is what you signed up for. You can call it old school or classical fantasy or whatever, but you're just not going to get cat people and dragon folk in this one. The cultures, as they're called, are presented in a refreshingly simple and straightforward manner, with a 2-page spread for each one. The first are the Bardings, quote, Northmen of noble origins, hailing from Wilderland, far off to the east. They are the so-called denizens of Middle-earth, basic human stock. When you roll up a character in this game, you'd refer to the culture page to get your core stats of strength, heart, and wits, as well as your derived stats of endurance, hope, and parry, and your skills. The dwarves of Durin's folk are the only dwarves you get in this game. They're a dwindling people, rich from the conquest of Smog in the Lonely Mountain, and strong and stout. For each of these cultures, you are strongly suggested on what kind of weapon class to use. And by the way, there are only 4. Axes, bows, spears, and swords. Dwarves of Durin's folk use axes and swords and cannot use great bows, great spears, or great shields. The elves of Lindon, also known as the fair folk of Eriador, are reclusive immortals who used to live among men in this realm, but more and more over the eons they have sailed away to Valinor, never to return. If you recall, Bilbo Baggins himself and later Frodo sail off to Valinor, and it's depicted as a sort of heavenly realm where life is eternal. Anyways, elves do their adventuring until they're about 300 years old, and then they bugger off to Valinor. They favor bows and spears, but can use any of the weapons, and they speak Sindarin, the fair tongue of the elves that you hear a lot of in the movies. Oh, it also bears mentioning that each of these cultures has a blessing and a curse represented by one kind of special mechanic or another. For the elves, the blessing is that they can spend hope points to achieve an enhanced success on a skill roll as long as they don't have the miserable condition. Their curse is that they can't remove more than 1 point of shadow at a time during a special recovery phase called the Fellowship phase. And here we have the whole point of the game, at least in my opinion. The Hobbits of the Shire. Later on in the book, it details how to roll up a Hobbit of Bree, and that would have been nice to have that information here, but I understand why they didn't want to break up their tidy 2-page spreads for each culture. Anyway, Hobbits are child-sized people who come of age at 33 and are usually very cheerful and friendly. They can't use large weapons and actually have a prescribed list of weapons that they can use: axes, bows, clubs, cudgels, daggers, short swords, short spears, and spears. Their blessing is that any wisdom roll is favored and you get 1d6 on all shadow tests triggered by greed. Men of Bree are another culture of humans, and they are described as the inhabitants of the Bree land and its 4 villages. They tend to be brown-haired and short and stocky. Really, they're just barely distinguishable from Bardings, if at all. And finally, the Rangers of the North, a quote, secret people, severely diminished in number with the passing of 1,000 years. They wander in disguise among the ruins of what was once their kingdom in Arnor, tirelessly patrolling its many paths and roads. They are the last descendants in the north of the Dunedain, kings among men that once came to Middle-earth over the sea out of the Western S. This is the culture of Aragorn, a sort of guardian culture of royal descendants who sometimes speak Sindarin and all carry a Sindarin name. Rangers carry with them a particular backstory that is really pretty different from the other 2 human cultures. If you're into playing that moody, smoldering, hooded loner type, this is probably what you're looking for. One thing to note is that the book's description really downplays the longevity of these descendants of Dunedain, saying that they retain their strength a bit longer than normal. In fact, Aragorn was almost 90 years old in The Lord of the Rings and nearing the prime of his life as the lore goes. So these folks are quite a bit different from the average human in this regard. After picking out a culture, you would then choose from one of 6 callings, each of which designate 2 favored skills, a soft narrative perk, and a particular shadow path, a sort of progression track to ultimate doom if you accumulate too many shadow points. Weapon variety in this game seems basic at first, you just have 4 types of weapons, but they break down into 14 specific named weapons, and along with your armor and optional shield, it can get quite varied because one of the main ways you level up in this game is through so-called rewards. Rewards come exclusively in the form of exotic upgrades to your weapons and armor. More on that in a minute. I don't want to get too in the weeds with this, but this game also puts a good amount of emphasis on inventory and encumbrance. It forces you to make some hard decisions if you come upon a hoard of treasure. If you don't have pack animals, you're going to have a hard time carrying that treasure home. So there are several ways to level up in this game. Over the course of play, you increase your ranks in both Valor and Wisdom. These both start at rank 1 and can go to rank 6. You use Valor to gain rewards to upgrade your gear. You use Wisdom to gain virtues, which are particular abilities of your chosen folk. There's also a whole patron system, a built-in NPC that helps your party along in one way or another. The book names 6 specific characters that could be a starting patron, and later in the book details each of these NPCs in pretty deep detail. The idea is that these characters launch your adventure or campaign, but new patrons of your own invention can later be introduced. A group's fellowship is a point pool shared by everyone and can be used to recover points of hope when resting. So the full picture on how you level up in this game is this. You get 2 kinds of experience points at the end of each session, a whopping 3 skill points at the end of every session, which you can use to spend directly increasing your skill ratings, and adventure points, which are used to improve either your combat proficiencies, your valor, or your wisdom. You get a whopping 3 adventure points at the end of every session as well. I say whopping because it's a fairly generous allotment of XP for completing a session. I actually really love this design choice rather than basing XP awards on whether or not players did certain actions during a session. Here, they really ensure a healthy character progression no matter what. It may not be realistic or logical as far as what may have happened in-game, but it ensures that players experience steady growth and access to more powers and upgrades without feeling like they're treading water. That being said, You're only allowed to spend your XP during a fellowship phase, which happens every 3 sessions or so. But still, the satisfaction of racking up guaranteed XP at the end of each session is pretty nice. There's a whole heir system here that left me a little cross-eyed. Basically, you can roll up a new character who is descended either by blood or some other means to your previous character, and there are a bunch of fiddly rules on how to do it. I understand what they tried to do here, which is recreate the relationship between Bilbo and his young nephew Frodo as one adventure passing down the mantle to his next of kin, or maybe to a lesser degree, Boromir down to Faramir. I just found the rules for it uncharacteristically convoluted when compared to the rest of the game. The game does actually get continually more complex as you read on. It never really gets daunting, but there end up being a lot of numbers to track. At the core of your character, you have 3 stats: strength, heart, and wit. Under each of those 3 are 6 skills, each with a rating of 0 to 6. These numbers determine how many d6s you roll for a skill test. Then you have combat proficiencies, a list of 4 different weapon types, each with a rating of 0 to 6. When you attack with one of these weapons, you use your combat proficiency rating to tell you the number of d6s to throw. If you have a 0 rating, you just roll the d12 feat die for the roll. Incidentally, a combat proficiency roll can never be favored for any reason, meaning you can't roll 2d12 and keep the better result. Every character also has an endurance and a hope stat. Endurance represents a character's resistance and stamina. When their endurance is down to 0, they go unconscious and will wake up in an hour with 1 endurance if left unharmed, unless they're wounded. Hope is a character's reserve of spiritual fortitude. When that reaches 0, they are demoralized. And anytime a character's shadow points match or go above their hope score, they gain the condition miserable. As I mentioned, increasing valor means unlocking upgrades to gear called rewards. There are 6 types of rewards, and each of these upgrades can only be applied once to any piece of gear. I thought the strangest thing here was that upgraded gear is completely non-transferable. The game calls it plot immunity. The gear cannot be lost, permanently broken, or given away, or even inherited in the case of the character's death. This is a pretty interesting conceit because it means upgraded gear is more than just gear. It's an immutable aspect of your character. When you level up your gear through rewards, you're leveling yourself up in a fundamental way. As far as the virtues you can earn through wisdom, there are 6 generic ones that you can stack. So for example, you can choose hardiness multiple times, increasing your endurance by 2 points each time. Then there are culture-specific virtues, 6 to each culture. These really do help to distinguish the 3 human cultures a bit, and just generally add a lot of gameplay variety since they all offer one exotic rule or another. My biggest gripe here, which is actually kind of a small one, is that there's pretty much no way of writing up to 6 virtues in the little box on the game's official character sheet. You have enough space here to maybe write down 1 or 2, so there's that to consider. There are 2 play phases of the game, the first being the adventure phase. This is supposed to take up about 3 sessions of play, and you could consider it the main gameplay phase. You're basically doing 3 types of things in adventuring phase, and that's travel, counsel, and combat. Combat consists of first resolving long-distance volleys, then close-quarter attacks each round. Each character can assume one of 4 stances at the start of their round: forward, open, defensive, and rearward. The open stance doesn't offer any bonuses or penalties, but the others do. Each character's stance determines their turn order, and if multiple players are in the same stance, they have to discuss who goes first. Each player gets 1 main action and 1 secondary action per round. As far as how to determine a hit, a player needs to roll a total dice sum that meets or beats their strength target number, which is derived from their strength stat, modified by the enemy's parry rating. Likewise, in defending against a hit, the enemy has to meet or beat the player's parry score, which is tucked down in the wits section of the character sheet. I'll also have a link to an alternate third-party character sheet that organizes things a little better. Taking damage means a reduction in endurance points. PCs at 0 endurance are unconscious, but generally, monsters and enemies reduced to 0 endurance are considered dead. If you roll up 1 or more 6s on a d6, that's the Elven T with the specialty dice, you can buy special damage like Heavy Blow, Fend Off, or Pierce, which each have their own special rules for extra pain on the enemy. When a character first picks up the wounded condition, they roll on the wound severity table at the bottom right down here. If they get wounded a second time before being able to heal their condition, or roll an 11 on the wound severity table, they enter a state of dying. To avoid dying, they have to receive a successful healing skill roll within the hour. Another in-game activity in the adventuring phase is called Council. This whole thing is obviously meant to emulate the Council of Elrond scene in the books where everyone gets together to discuss what to do with Sauron's ring, although there are some other council scenes in the books. In this game, there are some special rules involved, but it basically applies to any scene where the stakes are high and the PCs want to convince NPCs of something. It plays out sort of like an extended task with a certain number of attempts that can be made to do the convincing. Players can invoke a number of different skills to get the job done, and there is some wiggle room for the GM to award good role-playing in a council scene. The third and final major thing players do in the adventuring phase is journey. This is an interesting aspect of the game because there are rules and a lot of structure to it, but the book explicitly says, quote, "Gameplay during a journey is less focused on details. Whenever possible, everyone involved should try and avoid explicitly referencing the rules and rather blend the structure into an ongoing narrative." I really appreciate that sentiment of not using the rules that much, but to be honest, the rules for Journey are pretty fun. Players can take on the role of guide, hunter, lookout, and scout, and you follow a sequence of actions. First is setting a path using a map. If you're lucky, you're playing this game in person with your friends, and you can bust out one of those 2 cloth maps that Free League has made for this game. The next step is to throw dice to determine the outcome of events that happen along the way. Oh, by the way, there is a whole sheet dedicated to journeys, and the book includes a cool example of what a filled out journey sheet might look like. I don't think that journal section on the top right is really big enough, but the sheet does allow you to track travel fatigue and journey rolls and events and everything, and it's pretty nice. As far as resolving journey events, there are a couple of tables to randomize what happens and to who. This is not the most comprehensive set of journeying tables, to be honest, but if you followed the book's advice, you wouldn't even be using them at all. The Fellowship phase is basically a downtime session meant to be played every 4th game session or so, and it's where characters can recover and pursue level progression. You start by selecting a duration, which is anywhere from a week to several months. Then you choose a destination. Usually this is a safe haven area like Rivendell or somewhere in Bree. Then characters spend their accumulated experience points. They can increase their skills with skill points and use adventure points to increase their wisdom, valor, or combat proficiencies. They can also recover hope points up to their heart stats value. The final step is to choose an undertaking. There are 8 listed undertakings, but some of them are only limited to a special fellowship phase called the Yule Fellowship phase. That only occurs once in every 9 or so game sessions at the end of the calendar year. Here's a list of all the undertakings you can choose from, and I guess if you played this game long enough, you could probably make up some more of your own. The GM section of this book is fairly unique and tailored to the specific game. There are about 4 pages or so dedicated to generic advice, but it doesn't do a lot of handholding in this regard. One interesting passage in this section addresses the worry that some people might have about violating Tolkien's canon. The book offers several ways out of this dilemma of being paranoid about breaking the prescribed world. The first thing they ask you to consider is the fact that The Lord of the Rings may have been a story written by an unreliable narrator in the first place, and that its description of the story is subjective and biased. If that were the case, then of course you could do with the story and the world what you wish. The second consideration is that there are plenty of blank spots in the narrative of Middle-earth and plenty of stories left untold for your table to address. The third thing that they mention is the fact that during his lifetime, Tolkien changed his own canon many times, publishing revised visions of his books that altered established facts about his world. With that in mind, Middle-earth is not immutable, but rather something that can be changed and molded. One of the most thematic mechanics of the game, I thought, was shadow. Characters will occasionally trigger a shadow test, either from dread, greed, or their own misdeed. And when they do, they have to roll either their valor or their wisdom in a shadow test to try and avoid picking up a shadow point. Actually, with a misdeed, there is no way to avoid picking up shadow. With enough shadow points accumulated, they plunge into a singular bout of madness that manifests as an outburst of fear, lust, rage, or betrayal. After that scene, they clear all their shadow points, but increase their shadow path track by 1. As your character advances on their shadow path, which is determined by your calling, they will eventually go completely insane. In the case of an elf, the urge to sail off to Valinor becomes irresistible. Either way, your character is finished and taken out of the game. This chapter then dives into its enemy NPC section it calls adversaries. You've got evil men, and I guess now is as good as time as any to address the fact that the book refers to humans as men. It's faithful to Tolkien, I guess, but here you have an illustration of an evil woman, and yet it's evil men. Orcs, you get a total of 5 variations, including a goblin archer and 6 kinds of trolls, 3 of which are cave trolls, and 3 stone. The stone trolls are the ones from The Hobbit that turn to stone when exposed to sunlight. You get some undead, but really just 3. A barrow wight, a fell wraith, and a marsh dweller, or essentially a zombie. Wights and wraiths both do embody physical forms, mostly, but they are exceptionally hard to kill due to their deathless feature, which allows them to spend 1 point of hate to get full health at the moment they would have otherwise been killed. The one way around this is to use a weapon enchanted with the Bane of the Undead spell. There are 3 kinds of wolves: the Wild Wolf, Wolf Chieftain, and Hound of Sauron. And there's a goodly amount of space dedicated to guiding the GM on how to handle treasure hoards, specifically on how many and what quality of magical or special items are found within that hoard. There are also suggestions here on how to create your own special items for players to find. The book suggests making a treasure index beforehand that lists all the possible special items and treasures that could be found in a campaign, and then referring to that list when doling out the goods. There are a list of enchantments to choose from here, which on top of the basic upgrade rewards can really spice up the gear in this game. So whereas there are only 14 listed weapons in the game, if you consider all the upgrades and enchantments, it comes out to a decent amount of variety. Less on the hard number side of gear stats and more on the little specialty mechanics that can be attached to them. The book throws one last mechanic at you here, and it's the Eye of Mordor. There's a track called Eye Awareness, and when that track is filled, a scene takes place that puts the party at a disadvantage in one way or the other. There's really no other way to put it. It's like a Doom track, but when the track is full, there's one sort of unpleasant scene, and then the track is reset. I'll admit, I was pretty excited to get into this section of the book because I initially thought that this game was going to deliver a full treatment of Middle-earth lore. What I got instead was a fairly restrained, tightly focused treatment of all the locations relevant to The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. It actually turned out okay. The section runs about 35 pages and breaks down the world map bit by bit, and tucked into these boxes and other places about every second or third page is a plot hook that GMs can use to design an adventure from. Oh, and this box on the bottom right is where you can find out how to roll up a Bree Hobbit as opposed to a default Shire Hobbit. When you look at the encounter tables in this chapter, you get a pretty good sense of the scope of adventure that the game is trying to offer. And that scope appears to be fantasy adventuring of a certain medium intensity. Even though the game is called The One Ring, you are not expected to encounter the One Ring, at least not within the scope of the core rules. In fact, unless I missed it, none of the rings of power, the 3 for the elves, 7 for the dwarves, and 9 for the humans, make their way into this game, at least not by name. You could very easily, however, use the tools, starting back on page 160, to create a ring of power and stick it into your game. There are a couple of special offerings at the very end of this book. One is the Star of the Mist, a fully described, location-based adventure surrounding a ruined fortress. It's nicely done and guides the GM through a number of fun encounters. The second neat thing at the end here is a section called Nameless Things. This is basically a generator where you can design a completely unique creature or nemesis for the player to face. I really appreciated this section because it's the only place in the book where you see the authors really boldly diverge from The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. But here you can really let loose and make something weird. Not that you couldn't already do that, but it's nice that the creators really give a green light here. The Rivendell Supplement is included in the One Ring bundle, or you can buy it separately along with the GM screen. The supplement runs 16 pages and provides essentially 3 things: a location description, related NPCs, and a playable culture, the High Elves of Rivendell. Rivendell is a secret elven kingdom that was founded by Elrond Half-Elven back in the Second Age 5,000 years ago. The overview map of Rivendell here is a bit small, I think, with just 11 buildings, but you get a pretty thorough room-by-room description of the House of Elrond. I was left wondering what this was for exactly. Using a dungeon-style description like this is usually for combat encounters and looting, which I guess you could set up in the House of Elrond, but it would be kind of a strange scenario. The NPC description of Elrond is thorough, and you also get a short description of his daughter Arwen, as well as some others, all elves tied closely to Elrond himself. Elves as a playable culture are my favorite part of this supplement, and it gives you a taste of how Free League might expand the game. The High Elves here mechanically track the elves from the core book fairly closely. I did notice that they can speak another elvish language called Quenya. These are fancy elves. Actually, that's it for this supplement. The actual content runs 11 pages, but it's a nice bite-sized morsel of content that doesn't get lost in the weeds of the details. All said and done, the starter set rules booklet runs about 20 pages of content and covers almost all of the game's mechanics as far as I can tell. It's a pretty dense document, to be honest, but that's to be expected of a booklet that tries to compress a game of this size into as few pages as possible. But it's interesting to see what this game looks like when you strip away all of the layout flourishes and illustrations and just deliver the rules. It's not particularly fun to read in this manner, truth be told. There's an adventure supplement just titled The Adventures on the cover, but is more specifically titled The Conspiracy of the Red Book. This is actually 5 separate adventures that are intended to be played as a series using the pre-generated characters included in the starter set. I'm not going to page through this supplement because I don't want to spoil it, but I found the presentation to be really well done and a bit on the shorter side compared to a lot of Free League adventures, and I appreciated that. I'm not really into pages and pages of text walls in pre-written adventures, and each of these adventures here only run about 4 pages each, and it's great. Definitely the most satisfying element of the starter set box for me, and maybe of the whole One Ring bundle, is the Shire booklet. It runs a surprising 56 pages, and it digs into the history of the hobbits in Middle-earth with a depth and attention that far exceeds the attention given to any other setting element anywhere else in the game's core book or supplements. You can tell that this supplement was written from a place of love, and the map of the Shire that's included in the booklet and printed large is really a remarkable artifact in and of itself. The map is in fact broken down into regions and each described at length part by part, and the booklet is packed with plot hooks and special NPCs. It wasn't until I actually got to this supplement that I truly felt spoiled, but I'm not sure I would have wanted every last culture and region in the game to receive this kind of detail. The fact that it was the hobbits who got all the love just couldn't have made me happier. And to top it off, they snuck a few more full-color in-chapter illustrations in this one, stuff that's worthy of wall posters. I'm not actually sure where the information for all these details of the Shire came from, and frankly, I didn't know the Shire was this large and varied. But considering how Tolkien estate licensing works, I feel confident that the stuff in this supplement is within the realm of official and canon. And like I said at the top of the video, that's important to me in this context. In the situation where I want name brand hobbits and everything that makes them who they are, this one single supplement just goes ahead and delivers in spades. The people at Free League and who Free League hired to make this booklet, as filled as it is with hobbity details, they just get it. They are my kindred spirits, who understand at the center of The Lord of the Rings are, in fact, the hobbits. And it's not about providing an encyclopedia of the Shire, it's about giving the Shire to you as the GM to host adventures in. Also, you get a bit of Tom Bombadil, which is true justice. Alright, here are my thoughts on the One Ring 2nd edition. Cons. Narrow setting focus. I'll admit, before reading this one, I was really getting ready for a Middle-earth sandbox spanning centuries of history with different periods defined by different kings and just a ton of breadth. But the creators did not set out to do that, nor did they ever claim they would. This game is about emulating the look and feel of Middle-earth at the end of the Third Age, specifically in the year 2965, just before the events that led to the rise of Sauron. It's limiting in ways for sure, but if this game is successful enough, I'm sure Free League will consider supplements that cover other time periods in the setting's history to adventure in. A couple of things I'd like to see in the future would be an in-game treatment of Oliphants as well as of Ents, and Ents not just as NPCs but as a playable culture. Probably too weird for this game, but I'd love it. Another nice thing to see would be specific stats for the Nazgul birds or drakes or whatever, and stats for gigantic spiders like Shelob, and a map of Mordor. Basically, I'd like to see a full-blown Mordor supplement. Eye of Sauron. I was a bit surprised at how the doom clock in this game, the Eye of Sauron, ultimately ticks down to just one unpleasant scene and then resets. If I was GMing this game, I'm not sure I'd even bother with this counter. The actual triggers for the countdown are great, but the payoff is by default pretty loosely defined and anticlimactic. prose, spirit of the Lord of the Rings. Probably the most important virtue of this game is that every last fiber of its being is devoted to Tolkien's Lord of the Ring novels. The Hobbit is mentioned plenty in the books, but specifically Lord of the Rings is what the game is trying to emulate. Every point pool that you're asked to track as a character, from your endurance to your hope to your shadow and shadow scars to your fatigue, are all direct callbacks to the trials that characters faced in the novels. Likewise, travel fatigue and dealing with the rhythm of the seasons is also perfectly within the spirit of the original story. The cycle of play, with sessions of adventuring ending in a fellowship phase, also recalls the ebb and flow of action in the books. So whereas I might say that the game's greatest con, as presented in the core rulebook, is that it only emulates the Lord of the Rings trilogy, that's also its most remarkable accomplishment, in that it does it so faithfully. Not just by dressing a setting with Middle-earth sounding people and places, but by cleverly designing game rules around the action and challenges of the characters from the books. There's a sort of surface irony that the game is called The One Ring, but you never actually encounter the ring, nor is it really described anywhere in the game that I could find. But you really do get to experience what the ring symbolizes in the books, which is the burden of duty and struggle against an encroaching darkness. Dice mechanics, well designed. The system of d6 success dice and the 1 or 2 d12 feat dice that you throw for resolutions is extremely well thought out. The added complication of the d12 feat die opens the door to the advantage-disadvantage mechanic that they call favored and ill-favored, and there's some other moving parts that I love. Weapons complex in interesting ways. A glance at the character sheet's combat proficiency section definitely gives you the impression that weapons in this game are deeply simplified, almost to the point of absurdity. And it's true that there are fundamentally not that many overall categories of weapons, but the complexity of your weapon flourishes in the form of your so-called rewards and enchantments. Through rewards, or through finding an awesome weapon that your GM designed, your weapon can possess up to 6 unique little power-ups, and that's not including the enchantments. The Shire Supplement. I've already waxed on at length about what I think of the Shire Supplement in the starter set, but I'll just go ahead and say that those 50 pages doubled the worth of this game in my estimate. There is so much love and attention dumped into that booklet, all focused on the exact portion of Middle-earth that I love most, and I can fairly say that it expanded my soul just a little bit. I often wonder about games like this, ones that emulate a specific period of time and a specific story from a novel series. I wonder about their replayability over the course of years. Could your group honestly play The One Ring for years on end? I think the answer is, it wasn't designed for that. It was made for one purpose, and gamers get to experience it over the course of weeks or months, if they want, and then they move on. That's actually true of most RPGs though, but maybe over time, many years from now, you can pull out this old tome and show it to your nephew, and he can set off on his own adventures in Middle-earth. See what I did there, Bilbo? Alright, thanks for watching. See ya.